Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. I'm your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with diplomatic reporter Lazar Berman. Today is Friday, June 20th. Lazar, thank you so much for joining me again.
Good to be here.
We are going to tell a little bit of the backstory behind the news. And this week, while you and I were recording a daily briefing, you mentioned something that caused my ears to prick up a bit, and that is the historic Stop the Bomb campaigns that Israel, the IDF, has already carried out in the region. So I'm talking, of course, about the 1981 campaign against Iraq and also the 2007 campaign in Syria. So we're going to learn all about this and more when we're back.
Jews have to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. Thank you, Mr. President, for Jerusalem. No, thank you for banning Arabs. His message on anti-Semitism is a good message. Trump is saying all the right things, and he may even be doing the right things, but for the wrong reasons. It's a dilemma for us, but I think we still have to stand up for the institutions, for due process, even if the wrong things that he's doing help us in the long term.
I just don't see how they help us at all, because I
Well,
think in
consequences.
the long run,
There needs to be consequences. You can go out, you can march with a Palestinian flag. God bless you. That's fine. But if you use that flag to stop a Jewish students to go to class or beat them up, that's not freedom of speech. There needs to be consequences.
I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic reporter, Lazar Berman. So, Lazar, in every generation, there is definitely an enemy of Israel, but it kind of seems like in our generation, there have been several, maybe even three. And I'm saying, of course, the 1981 campaign against Saddam Hussein, and then, of course, the 2007 campaign against the Assad regime, both who were bent on creating nuclear bombs. So let's set the scene first on Operation Opera, which took place in June 1981. It was just before the festival of Shavuot, and Menachem Begin was the prime minister. Tell us what led up to this particular strike.
Sure. So the concerns over Iraq's pursuit of a nuclear weapon go back to before Begin. The Iraqi pursuit goes back to the 1950s, but in the 1970s, the Ba'ath regime, which would come to be headed by a man named Saddam Hussein, someone we're quite familiar with, he was already a dominant figure before he was president in the 1970s, and the attempts were initially through the Soviet Union to get a nuclear reactor built. The Soviets in the mid 70s wanted to put too many safeguards on it. They weren't interested in proliferation. So the Iraqis moved away from the Soviets as their nuclear sponsor and started to a friend of, to a country that is very familiar to Israelis when we talk about nuclear development, the French. Now, why do I say that? Because allegedly, according to some reports, et cetera, whatever I need to say, Israel has a nuclear reactor in Dimona, and that was built, according to all sorts of accounts, but with French help in the 1960s. Now, the French decided that it was of strategic interest for them to develop a close diplomatic relationship and a security relationship with Iraq and with the Arab world in general. And part of this was exporting nuclear technology, French nuclear technology, to the Iraqis to help them develop what they believed was a civilian reactor. There was also help of Italian intermediaries, but this was mostly a French project. Now, Israel picked up on this. There was no secret about the fact that the French were building it. It was an Osiris class reactor, and the French put that together with the word Iraq. That's where you get the word Osirak. Just so that's what that means. So in the 1970s, under the Rabin government working with the Carter government in the United States, there was all sorts of attempts, diplomatic attempts, to try to convince the French to drop out, try to get the Americans to intervene. That ultimately didn't work. Now, there was also a campaign of subterfuge, of intelligence operations to damage some of the parts that were moving through Europe. So there was operations carried out in Europe. Who knows who carried them out, but things were exploding in Europe. And also nuclear scientists were getting killed. There was a famous one, an Egyptian nuclear scientist who was heading the program, who died mysteriously in Paris. So there was a range of assassinations and people dying falling off balconies and such in Europe. And that certainly spooked French who were cooperating on the program, and caused Saddam Hussein to give a lot of money and a lot of incentives to his own scientists so they would continue to work on the program. Now,
So essentially, what you're saying, Lazar, is that France gave the initial tech and know-how, and then Saddam Hussein implemented it and used his own scientists from there off in order to get the nuclear bomb. Is that what you're saying?
no, because it was bombed at an early stage, so it's not clear, and we'll talk about this, where the program stood. And there was no way that there was French scientists and French experts in Iraq throughout. Okay, so that it wasn't they just gave it to them and they forgot about it. Of course, the French had responsibilities in terms of making sure that it was civilian, so that was a very big part of what the French were doing there. The IAEA was also very involved there as well. So there was French all over this program. Now, the Israeli, by the way, this was a plutonium reactor. In Iran, we're talking about uranium. This was a plutonium reactor. The Israeli main concern seemed to be that there would be a diversion of legally purchased uranium, so uranium that's not enriched at all, that they would not have to declare, that they could divert some elements from the existing program without the French realizing, or without the IAEA realizing, and then move it to secret sites. I think that to a small reactor that was nearby. I think that was the main Israeli concern. But there's questions about how close the Iraqis were. The Israelis say that it was basically they were close to getting, let's say, within a year, maybe a little bit longer, but they were very close to having enough fissile material for a couple of bombs within a year, and that's why they needed to act when they did. Now, I just want to emphasize that 1981, this is after the Carter administration was out of power. We're back to the Republicans, to the Reagan administration. There does not seem to have been a proper briefing by the Carter folks to the Reagan folks about how close Israel was and how concerned Israel was. And of course, we've moved from the Rabin administration to Begin. Begin, of course, much more aggressive in terms of security matters than Rabin was, and that's why we'll talk about this. That's why there was this thing called the Bean Doctrine that came out. But this was, different characters who are dealing with the same issue.
I just want to interject here because I'm quite a bit older than you are. And when I was growing up during this era, there were nuclear war drills being carried out in my British Columbia little elementary school. And surprisingly, of course, when I moved to Indiana later on, the same drill was used for tornadoes. Actually, the same very ineffective drill: go under your desk and cover your head with your hands. But nuclear war was so much in the zeitgeist. If you look at the films of the era, the books of the era, it was just on everyone's mind, and it really seemed like an imminent possibility. And so now you're talking about, spinning the globe and Israel taking note of everything that's going on. It seems so strange to me that Reagan wouldn't have been apprised of this situation when taking office, because he, of course, is the big champion of the Star Wars, anti-nuclear weaponry and things of that nature. But so the history books state, correct?
Yeah, but I think he wasn't read in on how likely it was that the Israelis were going to attack, and it wasn't, it kind of took the Americans by surprise, I think, when they were told about this. So, it could have led to more persistent and effective diplomacy ahead of time to convince the French to change tack or get other countries involved. But I think that is one of the things that fell through and which led to Israel attacking. Now, another geopolitical background piece, which is very relevant here, is that the Islamic Revolution in Iran, 1979, and very shortly after, you have the Iran-Iraq War. Iraq saw an opportunity and went to war against Iran. Now, Iran had been a very close ally of Israel, and when you're talking about the first year or two of the regime, Israel and Iran, their military still maintained and intelligence services still maintained very close ties. In Israel, they basically estimated and assumed that ties would go back to pretty normal at some point. So there was still a lot of cooperation. Of course, Iran didn't want Iraq to be building a nuclear reactor. They assumed that it would be used against them. Saddam Hussein had directly threatened Israel with it, but there was also, of course, a reasonable assumption that it would be used against Iran. The first attack in history on a nuclear reactor was carried out on this Osirak site by the Iranians in 1980. September 30th, 1980. They called it Operation Scorched Sword. American planes, F-4s, Phantoms, and they actually succeeded in getting through and bombing the site. Some of the bombs, bounced off the reactor and didn't do the damage. It did damage to some buildings, but not the damage to knock it out, and did not cause enough major damage. It did cause the French and Italians to leave, but some actually came back early 1981 to repair the damage. That operation, the intelligence from it and a lot of the photos from it, the Iranians actually gave to the Israelis to help the Israelis plan there. So you could ask why, but there was certainly a confluence of interests in both sides. It's funny when we talk about Israel and Iran in preventing Iraq from getting a nuclear weapon.
And so it came to be on June 7th at 4:00 p.m. during daylight that 14 fighter jets departed from the Etzion airport, and at approximately 5:30 p.m. they struck and destroyed the Osirak nuclear site in something like, 90 seconds? Is that right?
Yeah, it was very quick. So Israel started preparing. They were training basically over the Mediterranean where they had enough room. This is, I believe it's about 1,500 kilometers from Israel, from the Efrat Air Base to Osirak. And so they trained over the Mediterranean initially with the F-4s. Now, F-16s, which was the next generation of fighters, the first batch was in the region was supposed to go to the Iranians. Obviously, that wasn't going to go to the Iranians after 1979. So Israel was actually able to get them earlier and decided to use F-16s as the planes that bombed, and F-15s, 6 F-15s, to secure them, to protect them as the fighters. So that actually made it somewhat easier. I believe there was one pilot who died in the training accident, but the actual operation itself went very well. Why did it go so well? There was an Iranian attack on some of the Iraqi planes that could have been used for air defense, so that made our lives easier. Israel managed to find holes in the Iraqi radar, especially at the border with Saudi Arabia, because they weren't expecting a Saudi attack, so they're able to exploit that. So they basically flew between the Jordanian and Saudi along that border. I guess they had people whose Arabic was good enough to fool each side. So the Saudis thought they were Jordanians, the Jordanians thought they were Saudi pilots, and basically from there maintained radio silence and were able to bomb each. It was basically in 5-second intervals, dropping not precision bombs, but kind of general purpose bombs, I believe, the Mark bomb, and causing that damage. Now, interestingly, of the 8 F-16 pilots, a couple of them are quite well known. You have Amos Yadlin, who became a general, who was the head of Israel's military intelligence, still a very prominent commentator, and Ilan Ramon, who was Israel's first pilot into outer space. Of course, he tragically died in the Columbia disaster. So this was, and other people became generals in the IAF. So this small group of F-16 pilots really did become well known. And they were able to, again, No pilots, no damage to any aircraft over the site. They were able to get back. Interestingly, King Hussein, who was the king of Jordan, just happened to be on his yacht in the Gulf of Eilat, and he noticed these planes headed over, figured out what direction, like that the direction they're going in, and correctly assumed that they're going to strike against Iraq. He told his people to relay the message to Saddam Hussein, but that never got there. So that's just an interesting little twist of history. But yeah, ultimately the mission was carried out. It was bold, it was daring, it was risky, but no loss, and the mission was accomplished.
And Iraq definitely has no nuclear program, though, of course, it was a bit iffy for about 10 years. I want to jump ahead, though, and talk about one of the more lasting legacies of this mission. And that is, of course, as you mentioned, the Bean Doctrine. So I'm just going to read out what it is. And it is, in 1981, Menachem Begin stated, "On no account shall we permit an enemy to develop weapons of mass destruction against the people of Israel. We shall defend the citizens of Israel in good time and with all the means at our disposal." So we've seen this doctrine in play many, many times afterwards. What kind of, I don't know, governmental weight does it have, Lazar?
It's certainly not a law. It certainly doesn't, it's not an order. It's kind of an approach to the way Israel sees its security. Of course, the Holocaust weighed heavily over Begin. He lost a lot of family in the Holocaust, and he felt that he would do whatever necessary to prevent a second Holocaust. And this is the doctrine that has guided the way Israel deals with other nuclear programs, which we'll talk about. But if I can, I want to go back to something that you mentioned quickly, but I think it's important to expand on a little bit. It is unclear how the attack itself at a tactical level definitely successful. In the writing after, which continues, the academic debate about the Operation Opera in 1981, there are questions about how effective it was. There is certainly a lot of evidence that what Iraq went to after, which was to shift its focus, go to a covert uranium-focused nuclear program without French involvement, with a lot more investment, is evidence that this operation actually caused Iraq to move away from a path which was not likely to get to a nuclear weapon, a lot of people claim, to a path which was actually close to a nuclear weapon by the first Gulf War in 1991. So there's a lot of academic debate. I would urge listeners to do a little Googleage and take a look, because there's some very good articles written about it. But I think that's something to keep in mind. Even as we look at the successes of our current operation against Iran, the longer term fallout and the longer term decisions by our adversaries are not always predictable.
Okay, let's go to a short break.
What surprised you the most discovering about Jewish life in the United States?
I think it's the pride. I think I was envy of that pride, just being proud, being a proud Jew. It's something that I never even contemplated. I was just an Israeli. I think the fact that, in Israel, we have all sort of sectors in society. You kind of grow up with your kind. I hate that, the fact that I don't know a lot about my Jewish life. And I need to go abroad just to understand that. It's something so messed up, and how we grew up here. It's just, I think, once it got political to be Jewish in Israel, it made me kind of push away from that. Once I got to LA, once I got just being with my daughters abroad, just understanding what we are, my heritage, where we come from, our story, our values. Took me a long time. Took me a long time to get there.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic reporter, Lazar Berman. So now we're going to skip along in history and get to 2007. And in 2007, Israel carried out strikes in Syria. Now, this was a long time coming. It wasn't something from today to tomorrow, as we say in Hebrew. And the prime minister at this point was Ehud Olmert. But it seems to me that the tipping point to create this Operation Orchard or Operation Outside of the Box, I'm not sure which one dominates in terms of its label, but the tipping point was in 2006 when a laptop computer was discovered in London that had a lot of secret and very damning information. Do you think that was the tipping point, Lazar?
Yeah, so this was picked up on in 2001. The Mossad started to notice that there was visits by North Koreans. And of course, North Korea, a nuclear, now definitely nuclear power, but which was an emerging nuclear power. By then, they started focusing on this location near Deir ez-Zor called Al-Kibar, and started to notice it as a suspicious location. But things really came together when they were able to get a laptop in Europe of one of the main nuclear scientists, and were able to get color photos from inside the facility. And that left no doubt what this was, that this was a nuclear facility. They were able to get it. The man's name was Ibrahim Othman. He was the atomic energy director for Syria. And that discovery, they were able to, sit down on it within the Israeli system and also show it to the Americans, to the Bush administration, which was very important for getting their attention.
We actually struck Syria in September 6, 2007, but didn't actually acknowledge it until 2018, which is interesting in itself. But tell us about the actual operation, the strike in Syria.
Yeah, so we wanted the Americans to do it. It was the Bush administration, obviously, very good relations. But let's remember where the Bush administration was. They were deep up to their necks, I guess, in the Iraq War. The Iraq War was sold to the world as an anti-weapons of mass destruction operation, which turned out to be faulty. So to get the Americans to start a third war in the Middle East with two ongoing under the same justification was just too much of a lift, and Israel was not able to get the Americans on board. So Israel decided to do it itself. This was obviously much closer to Israel's borders, and there was a lot of debate over whether they would do it and how much fallout there would be. The fear was that Syria might even use its very significant chemical weapons against Israel. It had missiles that could reach all across Israel. And it was coming after a humiliation for Syria, where after the killing of Rafik Hariri in Lebanon, they were basically forced by the international community to withdraw from Lebanon, where they had been for a long time. So there was a feeling that this would be too much, and they would have to, Bashar Assad, who, had been in power for 7 years. He wasn't seen as especially, he was, this ophthalmologist who no one ever expected to take over, whether he would be forced to show his, that he had some spine against Israel. But Israel decided to go ahead with it. It was 10 F-15 fighter jets taking off. The escort this time was the F-16s, took off from Ramat David. And ultimately 7 made it. They destroyed a few sites around, and then while jamming Syria's air defenses, and bombed and totally destroyed the sites. Now, this did go along with some commando activity, that there was Shaldad commandos, which belonged to the Air Force, which had been on the ground, which laser painted the sites ahead of time, so it basically had targets to lock in on. And afterward, Israel didn't say anything, and Syria didn't say much. What they said was that there was a raid on this empty warehouse, but that was about it. But Israel had the discipline and the foresight to not start bragging about it, and also convincing the Americans not to say much about it either. And that gave this deniability, that Syria wasn't backed into a corner. Israel got what it wanted, but it didn't force Assad to to save face or anything, because it wasn't clear that anything major had happened, at least initially.
So why did it come out in 2018? Who spilled the beans there?
So it was already out because the Americans were talking about it, and there was demands from Congress. So it was outside of Israel, and these type of stories are very hard to hide, especially um, when people that were involved in it, involved in it, leave government. There was also books that came out from the principals involved. Bush, he had his book Decision Points, which came out in 2010. And he has a chapter on this. Michael Hayden, who was the CIA director who met with Israel's Mossad director, Meir Dagan, also talked about this in his book. So this was already basically out, but it just took a while for Israel to officially acknowledge what everyone knew, and it was an IDF. There's an IDF statement that did it. So it was basically to take credit, I would even say. But this was something that was no longer a secret. It was absolutely out there when Israel officially made the decision.
So let's talk about some of the themes that we're seeing between the two strikes, and of course those that we're seeing with the Iran strike too. And it appears to me in both of the strikes that we just talked about, in Iraq, and in Syria, we're seeing this convergence of intelligence information alongside really precision military prowess. We see this, of course, in Iran too. Without the Mossad intelligence, there's no way that the IAF could have carried out the strikes that it did. And I don't think in Iraq there were boots on the ground, but in Syria, definitely. And we talked about it earlier in this week, also in Iran. So what are some of the themes that you're seeing, Lazar?
Yeah, of course, nothing happens without intelligence and without the actual capability to drop explosives on nuclear sites. So that all takes a lot of expertise and planning and training, of course. And there's not that many countries that can do it in the world. But in terms of the kind of more complex themes and the more instructive themes, first of all, there's the question of how much Israel trusts and how much anyone should trust the nuclear verification agencies and process. I'll remind you, though, Syria was a secret site. The Iraqi site was under IAEA inspections, and of course, so was the Iranian site. So there's a question about how much we can trust that, how much we can rely on that, and what the use is there. There's the question of the diplomacy ahead of time. In none of these cases did we convince anyone else to get involved. Again, in the Iraqi case, the Iranians bombed it first. We might be looking at an American involvement now that we've shown successes in Iran, but we are the ones who have to do it. There does not seem to be the urgency among other countries. And of course, there's disagreements because there's no way you can know 100% what the intention is. There's always some sort of pretext for the reason that there is, some enrichment, and there's also always explanations for any perceived discrepancies between what they're supposed to report and how they're supposed to operate and what is going on the ground. So Israel tends, for obvious reasons, to take a more, I don't know if it's alarmist or a less sanguine view of any sort of discrepancies, and tends to treat very seriously the worst case scenario. Where other countries who are not on the front lines and are not under direct threat do not. And that's something to take into mind as well. There's also the issue of the fallout. So I'm not talking about radioactive fallout. That is obviously something that is a limiting factor, that Israel has to hit these sites before it would cause radioactive disasters. But in terms of the diplomatic fallout, okay, so the world was furious after the Iraqi one, including the U.S., the British, the French, the IAEA, all sorts of statements at the UN. Long term, really no damage was done. And you even had the Americans repeatedly thanking Israel during the first Gulf War and during the second Gulf War. And you had senior American officials, defense ministers, Vice President Cheney, saying what a gift Israel gave to the good guys in the region. If Iraq was on its way to a nuclear weapon and if Israel did not attack, that would mean when they took over Kuwait, they would have a nuclear umbrella, and they would definitely still hold Kuwait, and they probably would have been holding on much of Iran. So Israel also did Iran a favor as well. And of course, if America was going to get involved, they would be fighting a nuclear power. It could have led to nuclear proliferation and even nuclear war.
And in terms of Syria, in terms of both of these regimes, Iraq and Syria, we saw that there was no problem with either of them using the highest level of weaponry, at least that I know about, that they had. So there were grounds to think that these very bad men would do very bad things to Israel. Right now, in terms of the war that we're waging right now, the Israel-Iran war, we are, of course, hearing some support from some countries. From Germany, we're hearing thank you for doing the dirty work, and from other nations. And it's a bit too early to tell probably what the fallout will be diplomatically, but what is your sense, Lazar?
Yeah, my sense that this is as successful as we could hope diplomatically. It seems like President Trump, and I wrote this yesterday or 2 days ago, President Trump was kind of on the fence initially. He knew it was going to happen, but he continued on the first 2 days to urge Iran to come back to the nuclear negotiating table and to make a deal. And then once he saw the successes, he kind of got some FOMO and said, I want to be a part of this, and started speaking about like it's, also an American operation. He's saying we have control over the skies over Tehran, started warning residents of Tehran to get out, started demanding unconditional surrender, all caps. So he really has come around there. The French, the British, the Germans have all focused on the threat that Iran's nuclear program posed and stressed Israel's right to self-defense. So they talk about de-escalation. They talk about these things. No one's condemning Israel in terms of its key allies for this. It's just that there is, as of now, there is no fallout, and I don't anticipate any fallout. It's very different than the Gaza situation, but I think a lot of people understand that Israel's doing this in a responsible way. Success breeds legitimacy, and that's something important as well. When you're showing that your violent activities are actually, people aren't suffering needlessly, they're actually bringing to a much better good, then people are willing to give you some room. But when it's just kind of churning the wheels in the mud, so the 2006 Lebanon war, where America got the sense that people were dying, but it's not leading to anything better, they wanted us to shut it down. I think that's a lot of the criticism around the war in Gaza, that Palestinians are suffering. We're not sure how more extending the war is going to make things better for anybody. So therefore, the legitimacy disappears. So I think that's an important lesson that you can apply in many places.
I think another key difference between the wars that we are currently waging is that the IDF is stating very overtly that it expects to be finished, or that all its goals will be reached within a week or two. I think that also gives a bit of a sense of less discomfort with the deaths that are, of course, taking place in Iran. I believe hundreds so far have been killed. The figures are pretty much blocked by the regime. But Lazar, do you think that the cap of this war also gives a little more legitimacy to Israel here?
For sure. I mean, if this turns into a long-term tit-for-tat with Iran, then there will be a lot of attempts to shut it down, and probably a cry from Israeli citizens at some point to shut this out. But we've talked about this in the past, that Israel's security concept is based on short conflicts, short, intense. If Israel is able to do that here, it'll be absolutely reading the situation correctly, a very good reading of the room. That will satisfy its international allies and the capacity they have to support this, and also to bring to minimum damage what the Israeli home front is suffering.
Okay, Lazar. So we will speak again next week, and we'll see if indeed Israel is close to wrapping things up.
Let's hope so. And, things could be dramatically different by then if the U.S. gets involved. So we'll have plenty to talk about next week.
Always, Lazar, always. Thanks for listening to this week's Friday Focus. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. Until next week, shalom.